The river had been rising for several days before people altered their daily routines. I noticed the change near the quay on my walk to work. The stone steps that led down to the water were wet across their entire width. The lowest steps were fully submerged. The next steps remained visible but darkened and slick, with water resting on them instead of draining away. That morning, the barges along the quay were positioned lower in the water. Their decks sat closer to the surface. The ropes securing them had been shortened and tied higher around the iron posts. A dock worker moved slowly from post to post, testing each knot by pulling it with both hands. When I asked whether the water would continue to rise, he said there had been heavy rain upriver and returned to his work. By late morning, the movement of the water increased. Boards, fragments of crates, and loose planks moved past the quay in groups. They struck the stone embankment and broke apart. The water level reached the third measuring mark carved into the wall. In the streets nearest the river, moisture spread along the ground. Water collected at the edges of the road and near doorways. Horse-drawn carts moved at reduced speed, leaving visible trails behind their wheels. Shopkeepers lifted goods onto tables and crates. Some removed items from the floor entirely. Several shops closed before the end of the day. Rain fell again that evening. By the next morning, the fourth measuring mark was no longer visible. Water moved beyond the river channel and entered side streets and low passages. At first, it covered the ground in a thin layer. As more water followed, the depth increased. Cellars filled first. Pumps were brought out and operated continuously. In several buildings, they failed or could not reduce the level and were removed. My route to work crossed the lower district. That day, a narrow street near the quay was filled to knee height. People crossed it slowly, holding shoes and clothing above the water. Some turned back before reaching the other side. At the metro entrance near Saint-Michel, attendants stood at the gates. Water dripped from the stair railings and collected at the bottom of the steps. Trains continued running that morning. By the afternoon, the line was closed. Back at the apartment, preparations were already underway. Furniture stood on bricks, papers and documents had been moved to higher shelves. A small bag with clothes and identification waited by the door, ready if evacuation became necessary. Outside, carts passed frequently. Footsteps continued late into the night. On the third day, water covered entire neighborhoods. In streets closest to the Seine, water moved openly between buildings. Doorways were partially submerged. Ground floor windows reflected the surface. People leaned out from upper floors and lowered baskets on ropes to receive bread and supplies. Soldiers placed planks between raised points, forming narrow walkways. People crossed one at a time, holding the rails. I helped remove furniture from a ground floor shop. The water reached our thighs before we reached the corner. When we returned, the shop floor was already covered. Electrical service failed in sections. Streetlights went out individually. Some buildings lost power, while others remained lit. Lanterns and candles were used after dark. Light reflected across the water in the streets. Sound carried farther. Voices traveled between streets that were no longer visible. Wood struck stone continuously. Glass broke and fell into the water. Public transport stopped. Boats moved through flooded streets using poles to avoid submerged obstacles. Rain continued at intervals. After each period of rain, the water level increased again. On the fourth day, water reached the steps at the Louvre. The museum closed. Guards remained at the entrances. Sandbags were stacked, but water passed through gaps. Bridges were inspected daily. Some closed completely. Others allowed foot traffic only. From the middle of the bridge, water filled the streets on both banks. Food supplies decreased in the lower districts. Deliveries were delayed or rerouted. People relied on what could be brought by boat or carried along the planks. Bakeries on higher ground remained open longer. Hospitals were affected soon after. Ambulances could not reach several areas. Patients were transported by boat, wrapped in blankets. A nurse held a lantern steady as the vessel moved. By the end of the week, the river reached its highest level. The water stood more than 8 meters above normal. Streets that had not flooded before were submerged. Basements collapsed. Walls weakened and failed. Each day followed the same pattern. Morning inspections, movement of supplies, waiting, watching the measuring marks on the quay. For several days, the water held at that level. In some streets, it moved slowly from one end to the other. In others, it stood without visible movement. Boats continued to pass, but less frequently. Fewer people traveled unless necessary. Supplies were checked and redistributed. Some buildings were entered only to retrieve items from upper floors. Ground levels were avoided where floors had softened or walls had shifted. People gathered at the edges of the flooded districts and watched the waterline on familiar buildings. Marks were noted and remembered. Conversations were brief and repeated the same details. Nothing new failed during that period. Nothing improved. During that time, access was restricted, street by street. Soldiers and city workers blocked certain passages where water pressure had loosened pavement or undermined walls. Signs were placed at intersections, then removed when the water shifted again. Routes changed daily. People moved items only when necessary. Furniture left on upper floors stayed there. Lower rooms were entered briefly, then avoided. Floors creaked under weight. In some buildings, doors no longer closed properly. At night, the city remained quiet. Lanterns stayed lit in windows above the waterline. The river level was checked again in the morning, then again before dark. Late one night, the water level stopped increasing. There was no announcement. The following morning, the water had not reached a new mark on the wall. The level remained unchanged for several days. Debris collected against buildings. Wet wood and silt accumulated along doorways. When the water began to fall, it did so unevenly. Repairs began slowly. Dark lines on the walls showed how high the river had reached. Afterward, people continued to observe the river closely because they had seen how far it extended into the city and how long it remained before withdrawing.